How many people do you know these days with a neurological disorder? How many family members or people in your circle of friends have something like fibromyalgia or lupus? How about a brain tumor? Studies in the New England Journal of Medicine show a growing trend in the rate of such disorders in recent years. Perhaps like me, you've never given the issue much thought. But in 2002, I could no longer ignore it. I also became a statistic when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It was the summer of the Great Fire in Tucson, Arizona, when I began my research and traveled across this country to find the truth.
Well, yeah, the technology we have in looking at the brain has changed rather dramatically. Now, the increase in brain tumors has nothing to do with our ability to see these things, because that's been looked at. And the studies have shown that it's a real increase in brain tumors. It has nothing to do with our improvements in technology.
The National Cancer Institute recorded an impressive increase in incident rates of primary brain cancer since 1985, and possibly as early as 1984. Dr. H.J. Roberts, director for the Palm Beach Institute for Medical Research, found this trend particularly disturbing. At a time when this trend was singularly attributed to more innovative scanning and diagnostic procedures, Roberts noticed a series of conflicting themes. First, adequate brain scanning devices were widely available for at least 10 years prior to this report. Second, there were simply more people affected with brain cancer. They had nothing to do with the change in the way they were diagnosed or a different way of classifying the disease. Third, between 1983 and 1987, incidence of other forms of cancer outside the brain remained the same and, in some cases, declined. So why the vast increase in brain cancer and brain disorders since 1984? I'll refer to a published study by foremost neuroscientist Dr. John Olney. He suggests one likely candidate. In 1983, the U.S. population began ingesting significant quantities of a substance never before used for human consumption. Artificial sweetener aspartame was quickly introduced to consumers. In 1984, 6,900,000 pounds of aspartame was consumed by Americans. This rate doubles by the next year and continues to climb into the 90s.
When it was fully marketed for pop and everything by July to August of 1983, 6 months later, by 1984, the brain tumor rate had already jumped 10% in the United States. The diabetes rate had jumped 30%, and the incidence of brain lymphoma, a very aggressive and unusual type of brain tumor, jumped 60%.
The enormity of the problem is indicated by the fact that by 1988, in its own publication, 80% of complaints about food and additives that were volunteered to the FDA, and again, it didn't have to be submitted, had to deal with aspartame products, over 80%.
When you see these people who say, well, I take MSG or NutraSweet, it doesn't seem to bother me at all, they're more resistant to the obvious toxic effects, but they're still getting very subtle toxic effects that over many years is going to produce obvious disease in those persons.
Some persons can be exposed the first time and break up with a rash, have a terrible headache, and so they presumably have never been exposed to it before. But on the other hand, people who've taken it over the long term and exposing the body to large doses of the components of aspartame, then that's in the realm of toxicity.
And again, it's this variability in your sensitivity to toxins. Some people may notice very little, if anything. a majority of people will have one of a number of symptoms, because we know that the aspartame, because it is a poison that affects protein synthesis, because it affects how the synapse operates in the brain, and because it affects DNA, can affect numerous organs. So you can get a lot of different symptoms that seem unconnected. But in looking at the list of symptoms submitted to the FDA, most of them are neurological or in some way connected to the nervous system. So the nervous system seems to be one of the areas that's most affected. So we see people have difficulty thinking. They feel like they're walking around in a cloud or a fog.
It's a subchronic level. It's not like you go out and you drink a bottle of methanol and you have this acute reaction to it. What we're seeing over a period of time is this slow accumulation of toxins within the body that start to disrupt the normal activity of the brain and the endocrine system, which is controlled by the brain itself.
That really the sort of symptoms one can get are pretty protein. All types of symptoms can occur with aspartame. I mean, it clearly, so you need to look at the chemistry a little bit. I don't want to get too technical, but it clearly has an impact on what are called biogenic amines. These are, neurotransmitters in the brain, norepinephrine, serotonin. We've known for a long time that when you take in a lot of aspartame in conjunction with carbohydrates, you will decrease the availability of L-tryptophan, which is the building block for serotonin. There's been a lot of media attention recently to serotonin, a very, very important neurotransmitter, important in mood regulation and a variety of functions.
Aspartame is an artificial sweetener, an additive, and it's a chemical. It's not a natural product. It's a chemical. The molecule is made up of three components. Two are amino acids, the so-called building blocks of protein. One is called phenylalanine, which is about 50% of the molecule, and the other is aspartic acid, which is like 40%. The other 10% is a so-called methyl ester, which as soon as it's swallowed, becomes free methyl alcohol, methanol, wood alcohol, which is a poison, a real poison.
It really began with a patient. I had a patient whom I had treated for a number of years for a recurrent depression. She came into the hospital in what we call a manic state. That is, she was very, very speeded up, euphoric, on top of the world. I'd never seen her manic before, never looked upon her as bipolar. And within a day or two of her admission to the hospital, she had a sudden grand mal seizure, epileptic-like seizure. This is in a woman who had no history of seizure disorder. I really could not explain either the sudden onset of mania in somebody who'd been on antidepressants for years, usually in a bipolar patient, that is, in a manic depressive patient. An antidepressant will trigger a manic episode. She'd been on antidepressants for a long time, no manic episode. Suddenly was manic and then had a grand mal seizure. Clinically, I could not explain that, so we essentially did some detective work looking at what was different in this woman's life, and the only thing we could find was that she had made a decision to lose some weight. So she switched from iced tea sweetened with sugar to iced tea sweetened with aspartame. And she was drinking fairly large amounts of it. Now, you could speculate that perhaps the caffeine in the tea may have been a factor, but she had not changed the total quantity. She'd had this amount of iced tea for many years without manic episodes, without grand mal seizures. What was different was the aspartame. So I started looking at that, and it made sense that aspartame would lower the seizure threshold. That is, what we knew about the chemistry of aspartame at that point in time did point to the possibility that aspartame could, one, trigger a manic episode, and two, could lower the seizure threshold sufficiently for her to have a grand mal seizure. And that was the beginning. Then I found other patients like that and wrote about it. And that was in 1985, really 2 years or so after the introduction of aspartame into the market.
I realized that something was going awry but I couldn't quite figure it out. And then after several years, amalgamating this experience and patient input, and it's very important that you listen to your patients, because the great Dr. Osler said, listen to the patient, they're telling you what's wrong. I realized that the common denominator was the use of aspartame products, and under various trade names, particularly NutraSweet, Equal, Crystallite, and so forth.
I was primarily using NutraSweet, lots of it, because I was a big coffee drinker. It was decaffeinated. I was taking care of myself.
I mean, there was just all kinds of things that, the diet sodas, I used to eat Jell-O all the time, Cool Whip and gum. I used to, chew gum constantly back then.
Came home and decided I was going to be the good diabetic. I needed to be here for my child. I was going to drink the diet drink like crazy. I drank Crystallite tea. I'd switched from brewing my own tea to Crystallite tea.
And so for years, I went on thinking, what a smart person I am, drinking Diet Coke instead of regular Coke. And also, I carried it into other things as well, so that when I would sweeten my tea, I'd sweeten it with Equal.
And so when the low-cal Kool-Aid hit the market in, I think it was April of 1983, I started using it.
I would have a drink with a Diet Coke. During the day, I would drink Diet Coke or coffee, decaffeinated, all day long. I was never without one or the other. I drove 10 states. I always had a thermos of coffee with me, very liberally treated with NutraSweet.
I started out for doing blood draws, and I did the blood draws. I like talking and everything, and so that was a good area for me to get into. I was always hyper and all that, and I would drink the diet sodas like crazy there because we had it at our disposal all the time. And so the further and further I got on, and then I did Armed Forces Emergency Services with the disaster. We work with people overseas during wartime.
I grew up in a funeral home, in one of the oldest funeral homes in the South. I didn't meet my husband till I was like 35, 36. And we went on to have a child. And my weight just went way out of... And in the meantime, I had lost an eye in 87. I didn't meet him until 98. And I was told in 92 I had diabetes. Well, I tried staying off the sweets and the Coca-Cola and, drinking the diet drinks on and off. And
I was a briefing attorney for a federal district judge, John H. Wood. The U.S. courthouse in San Antonio is named after him. And then after serving as his briefing attorney for 2 years, I was appointed by Bill Sessions as assistant U.S. attorney for the Western District of Texas, and served in that capacity for a little bit over 4 years. And during that time, I was the president of the Federal Bar Association and very active in legal matters and things like that.
Had I seen the chemical formula on this product, I would never have touched it. The poisonous effect of methyl alcohol and its methyl esters are well known. And within a day or two of my starting to drink it, not only did I feel the deterioration in my body, where I couldn't swim anymore and I didn't have the balance that I had, and I was short of breath from a heart failure type of problem, but my wife saw all this much more objectively than I did, and she was a nurse, and she said, "Jim, get off of this. This is killing you. It's destroying you."
Well, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease back in '93 called lupus, SLE, systemic, which I had been dealing with. It was very severe, to the point where I lost my job and eventually my insurance, because over 40 doctors who saw me over a year's period kept doing one test after another. Every test came back negative.
I've had symptoms since 1983. I can go back to as far as 1983, and possibly even before that, but I only remember doctor's offices and the hospitalizations and things like that since 1983.
Around I'd say January of 2002, I started getting dizzy. I would go to the dryer to go take clothes out and fall down and not know why.
The reason I found out I had a brain tumor was I lost my voice during pollen season of the year 2000, or 98, excuse me. And in 98, my voice never came back from the pollen hoarseness that happened to me every year. So I went to a specialist at a local hospital here in Atlanta, and I said, all my friends' voices have come back, mine's gotten worse. And he went down my throat, and he said, well, your left vocal cord is completely atrophied, and it's been my experience when I see a condition like this that there's a brain tumor someplace that causes that.
Also, the vision, having spots, and I couldn't see, and I literally stopped driving because I did not feel comfortable behind the wheel.
My endocrinologist told me that I most likely have multiple sclerosis, so he sent me to a neurologist. The neurologist told me that yes, I do have multiple sclerosis.
I had been having double vision, and my doctor scheduled me to have an MRI. And we were waiting on the results, and I'll never forget it. It was, maybe a week or two before Christmas. And the doctor called, and I was just ready to hear, well, we couldn't find anything. Well, instead, he said, you have a brain tumor, and it's a rather large brain tumor.
And within a couple of days, I had gone from being a 2-mile-a-day swimmer to having such a toxic cardiomyopathy that I could hardly climb the stairs to my apartment. Over the next 6 weeks, I went through all of the personal hells of methyl alcohol poisoning and the neurotransmitter depletion from the aspartame's phenylalanine content, and eventually ended up with a picture of Lou Gehrig disease.
I still have a lot of pain, but she said, well, you'll live with pain. It's part of, even though it's in remission, you're going to have pain. So I went to Tampa, finally found a rheumatologist that she had referred me to, and oddly enough, he did the same blood test and said, you never had lupus, you have advanced fibromyalgia. I said, I just give up. So he said, well, I just don't think you ever had lupus, but for whatever reason, you're able to do what you're doing because of what she gave you. So let's just go ahead and treat you as if it's in remission, but I'm going to treat you for fibromyalgia.
But detail is very, very important. You have to get spellings named, birth dates named, everything. And with me being diagnosed with the neural hearing loss, which has gotten significantly worse I've been checked the last 3 years every 6 months, and it's gotten a lot worse. And now I have the 2 hearing aids that I have to have.
I took the ice pops out thinking they were just the regular ones that I'd been eating earlier. And my mother-in-law had taken my little one over to her house. So my husband and I rented movies, and we were going to have a date night, just night out, night to ourselves. And I pulled out the pops and went on to eat the 4 of the pops, aspartame pops. Well, this was on a Saturday night. By 4 o'clock Sunday morning, I was digging holes in my hands from the itching. I was bleeding. I looked like something out of a Vietnam camp from the bleeding.
The doctor explained that one of the very probable side results would be a loss of short-term memory. Well, I later learned that it had done a little bit more than that with me, in that it ruined my legal career.
About then, I tumbled, but only subconsciously. I said, well, I'm just going to get off this artificial sweetener, and I didn't really even consciously suspect NutraSweet, but when I got off it, then I started recovering.
My doctors will not come out and absolutely put down in writing that this is caused by aspartame. They will not do it. But they'll give me an aside like this, thank God you're off NutraSweet. That's what they'll say, but they won't put it in my records.
We were doing a shelter, and I was there, and I had the water, and that's all I did was drink water. And it was like each bottle I drank, the worse I got. And I had nothing else to eat or anything. There was nothing, nothing else that I was ingesting at all. So that was actually a blessing because I was able to narrow it down. This must be it. And I went around and I had the bottle and I was asking everybody, what's in this bottle? What is aspartame? And, everybody said they had no idea. And then that one lady had said, she goes, I've heard of it, she said. And then something kept flashing my mind, and I remembered seeing the name somewhere. And I like I said, I read all the time in magazines and all that. I don't know if it was in Time or Newsweek or something, but I remember seeing an article, and for some reason I keep saying that name. So after I had finished the shelter, I went and I was driving down the road, and my library, I volunteer at the library also. And so I stopped in there to say hello and all that and see how everything was going. And they actually had power there. And I went in, I pulled it up on a computer. At that time, I didn't have a computer. And I'd never searched anything in my life, have no clue. I knew how to email, and that's about it. And I pulled up aspartame, and my eyes lit up. I started crying. All those symptoms, the 92 symptoms, I think I counted 79 of those symptoms. I've been in the hospital or to the doctors and complaints over 50 times for each one of them, well over.
Turns out his wife was told she had lupus. She doesn't. They were getting ready to tell her she had multiple sclerosis, and she didn't. Her husband went home and jumped all over her and made her stop drinking the diet drinks, and all of a sudden things got a lot better for her. Yep. That's basically how it happened with me, Corey. I put the diet drink down, and I didn't touch it again. This was on a Friday. I think it was around the 19th of September.
Last year?
Yeah. And my husband looked at me and he says, the next day, within 24 hours, he says, baby, you're not slurring like you were. You're not falling down like you were either. And over time, it got better and got better and got better.
Because I was such a high user of aspartame through primarily Diet Cokes and Equal, and those are the primary ways, combined with the mountain of evidence and other testimonials of people who have had terrible symptoms of every type of malady that you can imagine. And when they're removed from the aspartame, the symptoms go away. That's what you call strong, if not direct evidence, very strong circumstantial evidence. Judge Wood, the judge I used to work for, the federal judge, in his charge to the jury, when he would give a definition of circumstantial evidence, he would say, if, as you go to bed at night, there's no snow on the ground, and you wake up in the morning and there's snow on the ground, you may reasonably assume that during the course of the night it snowed. That is an example of strong circumstantial evidence. You didn't see it snow. You can't scientifically prove that the snow fell from the sky, but it wasn't there at night, and in the morning it was. Therefore, you may conclude circumstantially that it snowed during the course of the night. And I would say that the evidence of my brain tumors being caused by aspartame are that strong to me.
And then they re-challenge themselves, knowingly or inadvertently, to serve something in a neighbor's house that they didn't realize contained an aspartame product. And these set of symptoms and problems promptly recur within hours or a day or two, sometimes within minutes, and it does so repeatedly, then that is more than anecdotal. That is similar like the Koch postulates for infection. You isolate the cause, and then you inject an animal, and you reproduce the problem. And many of these individuals who had been aspartame reactors have tested themselves 5, 10, 20 times, every time getting the same response, and then they realized that this was a legitimate cause and effect relationship.
My personal experience, from my own experience and with patients, is that when somebody who's been poisoned by this goes off it, they very quickly notice an improvement. And they almost equally quickly find out that it isn't over yet. They've got a lot of problems to deal with. And certainly because I had to suffer with this and had patient groups that had to suffer with it, and then I would consult with doctors around the nation who were pretty much expert in the field of environmental ecology, I developed some therapeutic outlooks that people can have to help themselves. But the first thing you've got to learn is to listen to your body. If something's going wrong, try and backtrack to what you had or what you're breathing in your environment or what's going on around you.
But the fact is, this thing has been carefully studied, repeatedly studied, extensively studied, so that, as I said before, the FDA concluded it's one of the most thoroughly tested food additives they've ever seen. And the conclusion is that it's safe.
They had made the claim years ago that they would help and support any legitimate researcher, that they would supply aspartame and be helpful in any research. I had published my anecdotal studies, and I had written a chapter in Richard Wortman's book, so I think the industry knew of my stance already. But then in the mid-90s, I wrote to the company stating that we wanted to do a double-blind study because my earlier work had indeed been, quote, anecdotal. And I pointed out that they had made the claim that they would supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher. At that point, I was a professor near UConn, Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine. I think I would qualify as a legitimate researcher. The company, I sent the protocol for the study to the company, and they responded that this was unnecessary research and would not supply us with aspartame. I offered to buy the aspartame. They refused. They put up roadblocks. They made it very difficult for us to purchase aspartame. We had to go around them. We finally did get USP-grade aspartame from Schweitzer, from a private firm, but the point is that the NutraSweet company made it very, very difficult, didn't follow through on their promise to supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher, said this was unnecessary, shouldn't be done, needn't be done. They tried to block it.
The GD Searle Company, in the quest to get approval for their product, aspartame, they conducted a study on animals in which they fed some animals, like I said, low dose, medium dose, high dose of the product, and then they used control animals that supposedly did not get any of the product. When they submitted this to the FDA and the FDA looked at it, there was some question about the study. Well, one of the scientists, a neuroscientist, looked at some of this, and he saw a lot of red flags. He said there's some real questions here about tumors being caused by this product, particularly brain tumors. So they ordered a study to be done by the Bureau of Foods, which was the precursor to the FDA. And Dr. Jerome Bressler was in charge of this group to look through the research that had been done by G.D. Searle, and that's what the Bressler reported about. And this is the report here. And basically what it shows is that either a lot of purposeful shenanigans was carried on to get this product approved, or, as he states it, it was the world's worst research. They found that what they did is the animals that died after being fed NutraSweet, they didn't autopsy the animals right away. Some of them were not autopsied more than a year afterwards. And of course the tissues broke down and liquefied, and so they couldn't do proper studies on them, but they reported it as if they had, and they reported these as normal. They found that they were taking tumors and cutting them out and throwing them away and saying the animal was normal. They had animal tissues that had obvious tumors in it that were reported normal. They had, in one of the cases here that's reported, a lymph node that was enlarged. And this G.D. Searle pathologist reported it as a normal lymph node. When the scientists from the Bureau of Foods looked at it, they said it was an obvious lymphosarcoma, a highly malignant tumor. The notations about the testicular atrophy were not noted. There were just numerous things in this report that showed that, in my estimation, there was an effort to cover up what was being found so that they could get approval.
There were so many things wrong with the submitted data from G.D. Searle originally. They had a monkey study, and in this monkey study, they were fed aspartame, and they were fed aspartame with milk. The milk, as you know, normally slows down the absorption of certain chemicals when you drink milk. If you take aspirin in milk, it'll take much longer for the aspirin to go to work. Well, even though the monkeys were drinking aspartame and milk, out of the 7 monkeys they had, I think 1 or 2 died and 4 or 5 had grand mal seizures. Now, these test results were not satisfactory to G.D. Searle. They weren't going to be able to show these to the FDA, saying, hey, look, aspartame, even with milk, caused monkeys to have grand mal seizures.
When we did our double-blind study here at this hospital, we had really a tragic situation which occurred, which I attributed directly to the aspartame. We needed volunteers. We looked at both patients, that is, people who had a history of mood disorder, and we needed some controls, that is, people without a history of mood disorder. One of the people that I used in the study was the administrator for our psychiatric unit. It was a PhD psychologist. And several days into this study, he had an emergency. He had an ophthalmologic emergency. That is, he had sudden bleeding in his eye and a detachment of his retina. He had to be rushed to Cleveland for emergency surgery. His eye could not be saved. He lost the vision in one eye. At the same time, we had another participant in the study, a nurse, who also had an episode of intraocular bleeding, that is, bleeding within her eye. So we had 2 people who, during the course of the study, had eye emergencies.
The bottom line was, here is the most tested product additive in history, an additive. Now, additive is important because aspartame was approved as a GRAS, G-R-A-S, I mean, it's generally recognized as safe product. In which case, unlike drugs, if people have reactions to it, it does not have to be reported to the FDA.
And what I found was really quite frightening, and that was that, yes, there were many, many studies in the literature which did attest to aspartame safety, but they were essentially all funded by the industry, either the NutraSweet industry or the diet soft drink industry. These were the individuals who sponsored, paid for the studies. There were independent studies, but virtually all of the independent studies, that is, studies which were not funded by the industry, virtually all of them did identify one type of problem or another with aspartame.
And so they got the test results they wanted by manipulating the method. This is not to say that aspartame was safe or that aspartame does not induce seizures, because it does. It's just to show you that the scientific data nowadays is unreliable.
So how you design the study is going to have an impact on the results, and I think that many of the industry-sponsored studies were set up in such a way that the results could be predicted ahead of time and would be supportive of the safety of the product.
Sounds great. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
There is no evidence at the present time that I'm aware of that aspartame in large amounts has a significant effect on brain chemistry.
Can we go through what exactly an excitotoxin is?
Well, an excitotoxin, basically what it does, it's a normal transmitter in the brain. These are chemicals that allow brain cells to communicate. But if it's in even a minute overconcentration in the brain, it causes the brain cells to become extremely excited. and they become so excited they'll very quickly burn themselves out and die. That was one of the first observations by Dr. Olney, and he gave it the name excitotoxin.
When was the first time that you heard about aspartame? Was it during that investigation with the FDA?
Yes, it was. It was in 1970, and it was an interesting story. I was called by Dr. John Olney from Washington University, who I had been working with on MSG and baby food. We had started an examination of MSG and baby food that led to the baby food industry taking MSG out of baby food. And it was done by the Senate Nutrition Committee. I was the special counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. And we ran hearings on food, and one of the things we talked about was MSG in baby food because it caused holes in the brains of rats that were being tested by Dr. Olney. And it was Dr. Olney's hypothesis that a substantial amount of mental retardation, 95% of which is of unknown origin, that a substantial portion of that came from environmental insults, chemicals in the environment, food, air, water, and so forth. And he was testing them. And one of them was MSG, and it caused these holes in the brains of mice in his system, and ultimately that led to having MSG taken out of baby food. He called me to say that he'd just done a study on aspartic acid, one of the primary components of NutraSweet, and it was doing the same thing as MSG. And that caused him to be quite concerned about the fact that Cyril Drug Company at the time was planning to use this as a sweetener.
But now, after years of retesting this, most authorities agree, there's no question, that feeding MSG to animals produces this brain damage. It's not questioned any longer, it's a fact. There's even good studies to show that if you feed the pregnant animals the MSG, their offspring has impaired brain function, and when you measure the neurochemical analysis of the brain of the animal, it's impaired all the way through the animal's youth up until adulthood, and they never quite recover from it.
In one of the conferences which I addressed for the FDA a few years back, there was a study with MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is another excitotoxin, it's a neurotoxin problem. And we could not understand why with the controls had almost the same number of reactions as the people had given it. But it turned out that one of the presumably inert components in these capsules of products with MSG contained aspartame. So it really was, there was something that even the investigators did not realize was a component of the presumed placebo.
The central mechanism that actually produces the destruction and damage to the brain is excitotoxicity. That's pretty well agreed upon now. The frightening thing is that we're adding tons of these excitotoxins to our food, either in the form of MSG or part of the aspartame molecule, which is aspartic acid, which is an excitotoxin.
Can we talk about the blood-brain barrier and how it breaks down? Like hypoglycemia can be an example of that, and how excitotoxins can pass through that on occasion.
Yeah, the blood-brain barrier is one of the big defenses that the industry always gives. They say, well, these things can't get through the blood-brain barrier. I did rather extensive research in this area, and what I discovered was that there are numerous conditions that we're all subjected to that cause the breakdown of the normal blood-brain barrier. Number one is aging. As we age, our blood-brain barrier begins to deteriorate. It becomes porous, so that anything we eat will pass through the blood into the brain. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all of these diseases are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Strokes, even silent strokes, produce a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Exposure to certain pesticides, herbicides will break down the blood-brain barrier. Hypoglycemia will break it down. Certain drugs will cause it to break down. Free radical generation will cause it to break down. Well, we know many of the diseases are caused by free radicals, like diabetes. You can have very high free radical levels. Extreme exercise, you produce a lot of free radicals. All this breaks down the blood-brain barrier. Multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, lupus, all these things are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So we know there are millions and millions of people out there who have at one time or another, a very porous blood-brain barrier. So when they drink a Diet Cola or they eat MSG, it passes right into their brain very easily. The other thing that we discovered was that even if you had a completely normal, intact blood-brain barrier, if you expose that person to a high dose of these excitotoxins over a prolonged period of time, it will seep past the barrier into the brain.
The same building blocks that are found in all of the proteins that we eat, whether they be bananas or meat or peanuts or what have you, they are found in NutraSweet.
Now, the amino acids are contained in food, but if you have protein, meat, fish, and so forth, there may be 4% phenylalanine in the food, but not 50%. And we simply, biologically, don't know how to react to this flooding of these enormous amounts of amino acids in the body, especially the phenylalanine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's meant to protect against, biologically, against poisons and so forth.
It's also what's called a dipeptide. That is, it is two amino acids stuck together. One of those amino acids is something called phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the building block for another important neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So when you take in aspartame, you'll increase the availability of one and you'll decrease the availability of the other. You'll change ratios. And when you do that, when you change ratios of norepinephrine and serotonin, you certainly affect brain function. And this can lead then to mood symptoms, to panic symptoms in some people. It'll affect seizure threshold, which is why I think I saw the seizure in this initial patient back in 1985, and why I saw a lot of seizure activity in people who were taking in a great deal of aspartame.
They knew that this product, aspartame, with time breaks down into a product called diketopiperazine. Diketopiperazine chemically is closely related to a carcinogenic compound that causes cancer in a lot of animals if they're exposed to it, and humans. So they asked the GD Searle company to do a separate study with the diketopiperazine. Well, when they looked at this study, they found some shenanigans as well. And one of the things is when you mix up the diketopiperazine with the animal's food, you have to homogenize it so that it's evenly distributed and the animal can't see it and avoid it. Well, I've seen pictures of the feed, and they left it in big clumps so the rats were eating around it, not actually eating the diketopiperazine. There was also evidence that they were giving the diketopiperazine to the control animals. And of course this came out because in the original study they found a 47-fold increase in brain tumors. In their diketopiperazine repeat study, they said, oh, well look, the control animals and the aspartame-fed animals have the same incidence of brain tumors. Well, when the neuropathologist looked at it, said, well, that's kind of strange because now your control animals have a very high incidence of brain tumors that's not naturally found in these mice. And then when they looked at the feed, they found out there were some mix-ups of the feed so that the diketopiperazine was being fed to the control animals. These are the sort of things that's in the Bressler report that the makers of NutraSweet would not like the public to know about because it's very frightening. You know, when the pathologist, Dr. Adrian Gross, looked at the material as well, very well-regarded pathologist, and he looked at it and he was absolutely shocked. He said it's just an enormous increase in tumors, particularly the brain tumors. And of course that's exactly what we're seeing now is this tremendous increase in brain tumors in this country, which is completely unexplained by the neurological profession.